So today, Reconstruction. Having gotten through the Civil War last time, the process of Reconstruction involves reconstructing the American Union, putting America back together again after 5 years of bloody Civil War that killed 600,000 people and saw 11 states of the American Union purport to secede and form their own nation. Well, they have been defeated. And now begins the process of reintegrating those states somehow, some way back into the United States, back into the American Union. This is a process that actually begins during the war. So by 1863, when Lincoln is still president and the war is still going on, this process of Reconstruction has begun. It will, of course, continue in earnest when the war is completed and the Confederacy is defeated. That being said, under Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, things go so poorly in a variety of ways that we'll explore that certain individuals within Lincoln and Johnson's Republican Party will take control of the Reconstruction process. And we'll have a period we look at first that we call presidential Reconstruction, where the president is more or less in charge. And then a period of congressional Reconstruction, where more quote-unquote radical elements within the Republican Party are in charge in Congress. During that time, we see African Americans for the first time in American history being able to vote. We see them casting their vote for their preferred candidates, and we see African Americans getting elected to state legislatures and even representing their states in the United States Congress. Having said that, by 1900, this is the reality in the South. There are no black people voting anywhere in the South. There certainly are no black people serving in any state legislatures or congressional delegations. So the two things we need to do today are figure out, number one, how do we get to this reality first? And then how the hell does this become this, white supremacy? This is the emblem of the Democratic Party of that time. How do we get from actual realization of our founding ideals to white supremacy by 1900? What goes wrong? First, there are a number of questions surrounding what Reconstruction would look like. I mean, three main questions. The first of which being, who would be in charge? The Constitution doesn't speculate as to what you might do or what you ought to do if there were to be some bloody, fratricidal civil war that tore the nation apart. There's no blueprint for this is how you would put America back together. And so there's no clear answer as to who would be in charge. Well, Lincoln answers that question during the war by using his powers of executive order as the president and as the commander-in-chief to sort of seize the moment and take control and sort of say, hey, okay, this is what Reconstruction is going to be under my watch. And so initially it is he who gets to answer the next two questions, which are, what will the seceded states of the Confederacy, what will they have to do to rejoin the American Union? What will be required of them? What will you do with former Confederate officials? I mean, if you're Lincoln, by your own telling, these are people who are traitors. These are treasonous rebels. Are you going to try them? Are you going to put them on trial for treason? Are you going to have them executed? You going to ban anybody who had anything to do with the Confederacy from participating in the political process moving forward? Put them in internment camps or something? On the other hand, would you just say, you need to repudiate what you have done, speak against that and more or less say you regret it and you're sorry and it was wrong and then we can all move forward together? And that speaks also to the last who there, which is who will be able to participate in this process. Can former Confederate officials simply, again, repudiate, that is, leave behind and denounce what they've done in the past, and now be loyal again to America? Or again, would you ban them, sort of let them live out their lives in obscurity? Would you put them on trial for treason and have them jailed and so on? Where on a sliding scale would you fall? For Lincoln, the word is leniency. Presidential Reconstruction is lenient. It's easy, it's simple, it's quick. It is not designed to punish Confederates. It is not designed to ban them. It is certainly not out to have them all tried for treason and executed. In Lincoln's view, enough bloodshed has occurred. You needed to heal the nation, not further divide it. And the way to do that was make Reconstruction as quick and easy as possible. And so those are the major characteristics of presidential Reconstruction, which Lincoln sets in motion by issuing executive orders. At the same time, more or less, that he is preparing to issue the Emancipation Proclamation and implementing it, he has also issued another executive order, the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction. This executive order lays out what presidential Reconstruction will be. Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction. What's that word amnesty mean? Sometimes these days you will hear that word thrown about in our immigration debates. It's a legal forgiveness, amnesty. That tells you what you need to know about presidential Reconstruction. It is a blanket issuance of legal forgiveness for treason against America. Provided, of course, that Confederate armies, where defeated, would lay down their arms, and Confederates would denounce their past by way of an oath. You had to take an oath and swear, I am now loyal again to America. I'm loyal to the Constitution of the United States. I reject what I did in swearing allegiance to the Confederacy and claiming to secede from the American Union. I walked away from that, and now I am loyal again. Only the highest of high-ranking Confederate officials under Lincoln's plan would be banned from holding office and participating in the political process. So if you're Robert E. Lee or Jefferson Davis, you're probably not going to get to participate, although the Vice President of the Confederacy did try to take a seat in Congress at one point. But beyond that, for the most part, all you had to do was take the oath. And once 10% of the voters from the last legitimate election before secession and Civil War, the one that saw Lincoln elected, of course, once 10% of eligible voters from that election had taken this oath, they then could set about the process of forming new state governments with new state constitutions, and then they could petition the United States Congress for readmission to the Union. And that's it. I mean, I'll add one addendum to that, which this needs to be maybe be easier moved up. Lincoln did create the Freedmen's Bureau, or at least was created under his watch. The Freedmen's Bureau was an administration within the executive branch that worked with the Army to assist former slaves when the war is over. Well, during and after the war. To assist former slaves who had been displaced, for example, who had run away and been separated from family, who needed medical care or food supplies or clothing, who needed to establish some sense of community wherever they were, including most especially, and this is probably the most lasting legacy of the Freedmen's Bureau, to establish the first schools for African Americans in the South. and also to oversee the transition from slavery to wage labor. The reality being, most former slaves were going to end up working the land, perhaps even the same land owned by their former master, but the key is now they're supposed to be paid wages. Freedmen's Bureau made sure that that happened. Again, with the backing of the occupation of the South by the Union Army. That's presidential Reconstruction. That's it. There are some in Lincoln's own party, including our own pal Charles Sumner here, along with Senator Wade, Representative Davis. These are what are called eventually radical Republicans, who feel like the president's plan is far too lenient on the South and completely bereft of, that is totally lacking any protections for the citizenship rights of former slaves. In the minds of Sumner and Wade and Davis and others, you're letting them off too easy. They started a war that killed 600,000 people and tore the nation apart for their own selfish interests. And then two, if you don't include in law any protections for the rights of former slaves, they're going to continue to be treated as slaves, or at best as second-class citizens, if citizens at all. Freedmen's Bureau is not nearly enough, they say. And so Wade and Davis co-sponsor a bill in Congress which would replace Lincoln's plan under the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction with their own plan, which would include a dry erase marker. I don't have one. That's sad. This would include what they call the ironclad oath. Oops. If you were able to swear to the ironclad oath, you would say, I have always been loyal to America. I have always been loyal to the United States. What's the significance there? Not just I'm now loyal and sorry about secession or me serving as a Confederate legislator or officer or otherwise elected official or voting for secession. This is effectively a ban on ex-Confederates because you couldn't take that oath legally and have been a member of a Confederate state legislature or an officer in the Confederate Army or a secessionist. The ironclad oath is in effect a ban on former Confederates participating in this process. It's changing the answer to that last who in the three questions, meaning who can participate? Well, not anybody who had anything to do with secession and the Confederacy. In other words, moving forward, only loyalists, people who had remained loyal to America during this process, who had voted against secession, who had opposed secession, who had opposed the formation of the Confederacy, only they could participate. And then two, the Wade-Davis bill would have included protections for the rights of freedmen or former slaves. It would have guaranteed that they be considered citizens and have the basic rights of citizenship, something entirely lacking from presidential Reconstruction. So it would have had the ironclad oath, ban on ex-Confederates, and would have included protections for the citizenship rights of black people. It passes. Wade-Davis bill passes Congress. Want to know what happened to it then? Lincoln vetoed it. Abraham Lincoln vetoed this bill. It does not become law. See how we have this cartoonish view of Lincoln? The great emancipator? Well, he was a human being with nuanced views, and above all, he was a politician. And if he thought that this bill was too radical and detrimental to the process of putting America back together again swiftly, he was going to veto it, and that's what he did. So it does not become law, but over time, the number of individuals who are in line with the thinking of Sumner, Wade, Davis, Thaddeus Stevens, and others who are more quote-unquote radical, that number is going to grow. And what's the check on the powers of the president to balance it out if we're talking about the president's veto power?
Is it the 2/3 majority?
If you have a 2/3 majority, you can become law without his signature. The radicals do not have such a majority at this time. At this time. That's going to change. Lincoln is, of course, killed, and his successor is Andrew Johnson. A man that had anyone thought really seriously about the actual prospect that Lincoln might be killed or otherwise removed from office and this man become president, they might have thought twice. A man routinely adjudged by historians to be lacking in the basic virtues necessary to be the president of the United States. A man who will fail miserably in working with members of his own party in Congress. And a Southerner and former slave owner from Tennessee. People confuse Johnson with Jackson because I guess we go pretty rapidly from Jackson to this point in this class. Their names are obviously very similar. They are both from Tennessee. They're both slave owners and so on. They both actually come up from very, very humble beginnings to become very, very wealthy. And they both have a profound disdain, perhaps even hatred of the planter aristocrat class of slave owners in the South. So just because they become wealthy slave owners doesn't make them like those who were born into wealth. And in Johnson's case, he loathed those people, and that's one of the reasons he remains loyal. He's a loyalist. He does not support secession. He does not support the Confederacy. He sells his slaves. He moves north and remains loyal. Here is an example of someone who could have taken the ironclad oath, for example. He was not Lincoln's original vice president. Remember, Lincoln stands for re-election in 1864. Well, the war is drawing to a close. Lincoln's thinking was, well, it's pretty clear at that point when Atlanta is on the verge of falling that the war is near to an end. And you're going to win, and you have to put America back together again. And this is a way of extending some sort of olive branch to the white South and say, look, especially you loyalists, we can put America back together again. See, there's a Southerner and a former slave owner in the White House. So this is a way of sort of looking forward to a successful Reconstruction. Again, no one could have predicted that this man would actually become president because Lincoln would be killed, but here we are. And it should be said that though he hated the sort of aristocratic, wealthy planter class of the South, as a man who'd come up from humble beginnings, he didn't give a shit about black people. He didn't care about slaves. He was a former slave owner himself. So he's not interested in any sort of more radical plan that looks at protections, for former slaves. That being said, Congress does move to codify or make legal the promise that had been begun to be established by the Emancipation Proclamation, and that is eventually the abolition of slavery in America with the 13th Amendment. So under Johnson's watch, states that want to re-enter the Union under Lincoln's Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction plan, and the 10% I'm now loyal oath plan, the one additional thing they would need to do is ratify the 13th Amendment and admit that slavery is no more. Some Union generals, including Sherman, who marches through Georgia, some of them had recognized, having seen firsthand conditions in the South, that lacking any legal protections from Congress or the executive for citizenship rights for former slaves, not much was going to change in the South unless there was a program of land redistribution, unless you took land from treasonous rebel plantation owners and gave it over to the slaves so that they could become landowning, as Jefferson would say, yeoman farmers in the American Republican tradition, and could till their own land and fend for themselves. And if you didn't do that, nothing socially, structurally was going to change in America, in the South. And so some generals initiated that process using their wartime powers. They took land from Confederate slave owners and parceled it out, 40 acres, 40 acres, 40 acres, to former slave families. Abraham Lincoln orders them to give it back. Andrew Johnson orders them to give it back. Even when we transition here in a minute to radical Reconstruction under people like Sumner in Congress, even then, there is never a program of systematic land redistribution. It does not ever happen. Land is never systematically taken from white slave owners and given over to former slaves. And the promise of what some Union generals had envisioned is never realized. That all making sense? No program of land redistribution. But oh, there is resistance. And this is really where presidential Reconstruction falls short. In allowing white Southerners and former Confederates to establish whatever they could of their old order outside of the parameters of the 13th Amendment. When they take this "I'm now loyal" oath, they start forming new state governments. They have to draft new state constitutions, and these new state constitutions have within them black codes. Here on the page, you have part of Black Code of the state of Texas. In your document reader or on Launchpad, you'll read the Black Code of the state of Mississippi. From a surface reading of the first sections of some of these black codes, it appears to be that these are designed to lay out what all former slaves could do now that they're not slaves anymore. In reality, the purpose of these, in this case, is set out in Section 2. Let's take a look. Nothing in here should be construed as to repeal any law prohibiting the intermarriage of the white and black races, nor to permit any other than white men to serve on juries, to hold office, or to vote in any state, county, or municipal election. In other words, Black Code of Texas says, sure, slaves aren't slaves anymore, but by the way, black people can't marry white people, and more importantly, they can't vote, they can't serve on juries, they can't vote in local or state elections, and so on. When you read the one from Mississippi, it goes further to say black people can only own certain types of property. They can't travel from one place to another without documentation. They can't own firearms. They can't assemble in large numbers. All of those would be restrictions similar and dating back to slavery, of course. Some of them even more restrictive. If you consider that in tasking systems, slaves often did own firearms, for example. And then there are labor restrictions. When you read the one from Mississippi, it will say, now that slaves are citizens, supposedly, you don't have the master-slave relationship, but what you need now is a labor contract. Because most of these people, because there's no land redistribution especially, are going to end up working on land that is owned by their former master, but now we'll have a contract. It stipulates wages and such, terms of employment. And that contract will bind that person to working the land for X number of years. And the black codes establish the policy whereby if a person decides they don't want to work that land anymore and they want to move off to Jackson or Memphis or Chicago, as they could, just free citizens, But if that contract's not up, that's not just a civil breach of contract for which they could be sued, that's a crime. It's a crime to break your labor contract under the black codes, and if you commit that crime, the punishment is a huge fine. A fine which is so large that if you were a freedman or a former slave, you had no hope of possibly paying that fine. And guess what the punishment is if you can't pay the fine? You get to work out in the fields for your employer, who is your former master, for free until the value of that fine is paid off. And what does that look and sound like? Working out in the cotton fields for free. Or if you're a vagrant and don't have a job and don't have a labor contract because you're tired of working, well, that's also a crime. Vagrancy. Just not having a job. Vagrancy, that's a crime. Huge fine. Got to work out in the fields if you can't pay it. Orphans, children displaced from their families by the war, wards of the state raised up in institutions where they learn how to work hard out in the fields growing up. Looks and sounds a lot like slavery, doesn't it? This is the idea. The black codes are intended to restrict the rights of former slaves and to recreate the conditions of slavery wherever possible. And along with this too, are violence and intimidation. Systematically even, you have the formation of the Ku Klux Klan, an organization created by former Confederate officers in the military. An organization designed to beat, murder, intimidate anyone who supported the Republican Party in the South. This would include anyone who is black who attempts to vote or organize people to vote or encourage people to vote. And also any white people who supported the Republican Party, including what white Southerners would call carpetbaggers, white people from the North who come south during Reconstruction, who in their minds simply come south to lie and cheat people and make money, acquiring the land of former Confederate supporters who had died during the war, for example. And to organize black people, now that they supposedly, black men at least, eventually will be able to vote, to try to get them organized under the banner of the Republican Party. This would include two people they would call scalawags. And that is white Southern loyalists, white Southerners who did not support the Confederacy. And so the Ku Klux Klan in American history, it sort of comes and goes. There are at least three major iterations of the Klan in American history. And this first one, their targets are not just black people, but also any white supporters of the Republican Party too. In effect, then, the Klan at this time is like the thuggish paramilitary wing of the Democratic Party in the South, which back in those days was the party of white supremacy. And I know that may be odd, given our current political alignment, but we will deal in later weeks with how our party politics is reshaped in American history over time. Questions?
So was the Ku Klux Klan at all, I won't say sanctioned by the government locally in the South, but yeah, were there prominent officials of the government that were also participating in that?
Eventually. So what it is at first is anti-government, because at the end of the war, the government's in the hands of the Republicans, as supported by the Union Army and the federal government. What the Klan does is work over time to get rid of those people, install white supremacist Democrats, and then, yes, by that time, then the Klan is in fact sanctioned by the government. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And it happens at different times in different states. But between, as we'll see, the late 1870s and 1900, white Democrats with the support of the Klan come to power in every single one of those states. Mm-hmm. And by 1900, then yes, they're the de facto, again, paramilitary forces of the state white supremacist government under the Democrats, right? Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
The radical Republicans in Congress understand what is happening and begin to convince others of their colleagues that this is happening and that it can't be allowed to happen. And so, as the realities of violence and intimidation and black codes in the South come to light, the number of radicals in the American Congress grows. Johnson is not moved, though, and sort of entrenches himself where he's at in terms of policy and ideology, and therefore is in increasing conflict with members of his party in Congress over what Reconstruction ought to look like, over what ought to be done. And two, he lacks the basic skills that one would need to mediate with even members of one's own party, mind you. And he butts heads with Congress, to put it lightly. They do not see eye to eye, and he doesn't help matters in terms of his own personality and abilities as an executive. To the point where he is eventually impeached, which I used to have to explain what this means and doesn't mean, but you all have seen it play out in the last few years. Congress at one point envisions that the president is going to start removing members of his cabinet that think and feel like they do, that are more radical in their thinking and see the need for protections for former slaves and a more stringent Reconstruction policy. So they pass a law that says, okay, the president has to consult us in Congress before he puts someone into a cabinet position, like Secretary of State, Secretary of War, as it used to be called. We're going to pass a law that says the president must consult Congress before they remove someone from their cabinet. You can't just fire your secretary of fill in the blank without consulting Congress, says this new law. The Tenure of Office Act, which Johnson violates almost immediately upon its passage, which leads the House of Representatives to bring charges against him, to bring articles of impeachment. The president has violated this new law. Now, as you know, to be impeached does not mean you are removed from office. The president's held accountable to the law, because we have the rule of law and no one is above the Constitution or laws passed by Congress, but the president is also entitled to the due process of law under the Fifth Amendment. So there's a trial in the Senate, with the Senate serving as the jury and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court as the judge. Johnson knows that he is probably going to be removed from office. He lacks the votes. He had not courted hardly any relationships of any real meaning in Congress. So he cuts a deal. He tells enough people in the Senate, look, if you don't vote to remove me, if you abstain from voting to remove me, I'll back off and you guys can take charge of Reconstruction. And that's what happens. Johnson avoids being removed by basically relinquishing control of Reconstruction policy. And now we have the period known as Congressional Reconstruction. And the radicals in Congress elect to basically hit a giant reset button. Everything is going to start over under Congressional Reconstruction. They pass a Military Reconstruction Act and a Supplemental Reconstruction Act that essentially eliminate Lincoln's plan under the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction, eliminate any recognition of the state governments that had been formed under that plan, put the military back in charge of the administration of these districts of the South, and start the process all over again. And say, okay, forget about Lincoln's plan, everything that's happened in the last couple of years. We're going to have a new oath, and it's going to be an ironclad oath. A ban on ex-Confederates, because what they did is create these constitutions with black codes and supported the efforts of the Klan and so on. So we'll start over, and only those who have always been loyal can take this oath and participate in forming new state governments. And when they do, we're going to make sure, even with these loyalists, that there aren't things like black codes in there, because we're going to pass a new law, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which says you state governments cannot single out a group of American citizens and say the law applies differently to you. Can't single out one group of citizens and say, hey, you're American citizens, but guess what? You don't have the same rights. You don't have the same privileges. You have more restrictions on what you're able to do. That's what the black codes did, of course. And they finally also pass an enforcement act, or enforcement acts, which allow the Union Army to basically treat the Klan like an enemy force and to engage in law enforcement in that way. Enforcement Act allows the Army to go after the Klan, to make sure they're not beating and murdering people that are just trying to vote. There was some question as to whether the Civil Rights Act of 1866, though, was constitutional. Could the federal government point its finger at the states and say, you can and can't make laws like this or that? And so what's the most effective way to get around? If someone's questioning the constitutionality of something you want to do, what could you do in return? Write it into the Constitution. New constitutional amendment. And so the Civil Rights Act is written into an amendment, the 14th Amendment. Which has in it an equal protection clause. What the essence of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was, in saying you can't single out a group of American citizens and tell them the law applies differently to them or they don't have the same rights and privileges. Another way to put that is every American citizen enjoys the equal protection of the law. The law applies the same to every American citizen. Everyone has the same privileges and immunities. Can't wait till LG trolls me about not being able to spell privileges. Then, there's also a due process clause. 14th Amendment says no state government can deprive an American citizen of their life, liberty, or property. There's that Lockean list again. Without the due process of law, meaning state government can't take your life, your freedom, or your stuff unless you've been sued and the process of being sued plays out and you lose. Or if you're charged with a crime and the criminal process plays out, the process to which you are due or entitled, and you're convicted. Then and only then could the state take your life, your freedom, or your stuff. Isn't that already in the Constitution, though? Haven't we already looked at a due process clause? In the Bill of Rights, in the Fifth Amendment, it says federal government can't take your life, liberty, or property without the due process of law. It's in the Fifth Amendment. Why is it here again? What's the difference? One word, but it's important, obviously. What's the difference between the Fifth and the 14th Amendment? Number one, the 14th Amendment is plainly designed specifically to ensure the citizenship rights of former slaves. That is the purpose of this amendment, no doubt. But there's something else different here. Fifth Amendment says federal government can't take your life, liberty, or property. Where does the 14th differ? State government. 14th Amendment says no state government can do that. In other words, the 14th Amendment applies the due process clause to the states. The language of the Bill of Rights, those amendments which are designed to protect individual rights, those are aimed squarely at the federal government. The 14th Amendment is the first amendment to directly apply one of those principles to the state governments. And over time, it has been used by the courts to apply other basic rights like, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, right to bear arms. It's been applied to the states using the 14th Amendment. But again, the idea here was to prevent any more occurrences of black codes, right? Where state governments are blatantly passing laws that are designed to restrict the rights of a certain group of citizens, in this case, black people. Does that make sense? And what's the 15th Amendment do? What right was considered so inviolate and important that it needed its own amendment? What right are you going to exercise in about a month or so? Right to vote. For freed men, specifically, for black men, 15th Amendment provides to them specifically the right to vote. And I emphasize that because not only is that the language of the amendment, but women attempted to, the women's suffrage movement, made the argument in federal court that this ought to apply to women as well. And there was a robust movement to make that happen that actually splits the abolitionist and black freedom movement among those who favored getting suffrage to black men as soon as possible and those who argued that this ought to have applied immediately to women. And then there are even those white women who argue it ought to be white women who got it before any black people and so on. But women made the case in court that this ought to apply to them, and the Supreme Court rejects that. And women's suffrage movement has to continue to fight for their own constitutional right to vote into the 20th century.
So why did they bring that to the Supreme Court? Like, the language of the 15th Amendment doesn't really say anything about women. So why would they think the Supreme Court would help them? That feels like a legislative issue.
Right. Well, I guess the thinking was if we had failed very clearly in one branch, if we could take it to another branch that we knew was more or less racist, but perhaps wasn't sexist, that maybe we could score a victory there. Perhaps the court could have judged that the legislature had erred in narrowly tailoring this. But they did. They fell back on precisely what you just said. This is the language of the law. It's up to the court to determine what the law is. We don't make the law. We just interpret it. This is what it says. This is what Congress put in there, and so that is what it is. And that's precisely what the court said.
That's just interesting to me that nowadays we talk about that all the time.
Yeah.
The courts have recently just started doing whatever they want, really. Back in the day, I feel like there was more, at least the guise of the Supreme Court just is the Supreme Court. We don't legislate here.
Well, it's changed. That's been different at different times. The court has sort of waxed and waned in that regard. And what we're about to see, too, what we look at more closely in my African American history class is the court more or less sanctions everything that's about to happen, which is the reversal of all of this. Mm-hmm. That being said, you could make the case, to your point, that they're simply allowing southern states to make laws that they see fit under, the parameters of the Constitution. Mm-hmm. But in any case, I will say too that certainly the women's suffrage movement was moving within the political realm too. They were trying to move legislation as well. Mm-hmm. Clearly that didn't happen. But consider when they do finally win, it is through legislation and through the 19th Amendment, right? So that was the channel that eventually, through which they pursued a path to victory, right? Rather than through the court.
Yeah, that's just, I never knew that they actually went to the court.
Yeah, the case is, the decision is Minor versus Happerstedt. Let's see if I can spell that correctly. So you can look that up and see what's the argument made. What does the court say? I think that's right, and if not, it's hopefully reasonably close to right.
Yeah, I'll give that a Google.
Yeah, do that and tell me where I've got it wrong. Where I fall short in spelling this. One T on the end, one P.
Hey, I think you got it.
Wow, okay.
Oh, it's Happerstedt.
Oh, no T there. Oh. That was another.
Pretty close.
Yeah, close enough. It's been a long time since comps. So with all of that, with the Union Army enforcing that under the Enforcement Acts, The 14th Amendments, states had to, by the way, states under Congressional Reconstruction had to ratify once, 50% of voters from the 1860 rolls had taken the ironclad oath. They formed new state governments. They have new state constitutions that are bound by these new amendments. They have to ratify the 13th and now 14th and 15th Amendment too. Then they could get back in. And what happens is the election of the first African Americans to public office, to state legislatures. Some state legislatures were majority black. South Carolina, Mississippi. And those southern states send the first black representatives and senator to the United States Congress. Mississippi will at one point send 2 black senators to Washington. But what goes wrong? We begin the process known to white Southerners as the redemption. What does it mean to redeem something? In this case, to get back what is lost. And in their minds, what was lost was some sort of fantasy land, an idyllic world where everything was great and wonderful for everyone that had been ruined by the war of northern aggression and ruined by black Reconstruction. No sooner do those new state governments come into existence under the Congressional Reconstruction Plan than you have a reinvigoration of white violence through the Klan and other groups that seeks to supplant those Republican governments. Because remember, you're a loyalist and you come to power during Congressional Reconstruction, you ain't a white Democrat. It's white loyalists, white people from the North, and former slaves that are coming to power in these state governments. Now, yes, while the Union Army is in the South, it's difficult for the Klan to work against those people and to use that violence, intimidation as they had before on behalf of the white Democrats. But the Army wasn't going to be there forever. And radicals in Congress, the old radical Republicans, they're going to start retiring and dying off. Charles Sumner ain't going to serve in there forever. Thaddeus Stevens is going to be gone after a while. Wade and Davis are going to be gone. The attention of the Republican Party is going to turn elsewhere. The Republican Party starts to become the party of industry and big business. As we'll see in the very last lecture before the midterm, America is industrializing in the North and in the Midwest, from New York to Chicago. America is also growing into the West. Remember, that's what partly got us into this mess. Westward growth and the question of would slavery grow out into the West or not. That was all put on pause. Stephen Douglas's Transcontinental Railroad put on pause for the Civil War. Not anymore. You can return to the questions of manifest destiny, which involves wars with Indians, fighting them onto reservations and taking their land so you can access gold and silver on that land, so that you can complete that Transcontinental Railroad. You can connect California with Chicago, with New York, and so on. You can build a massive railroad network. You can focus on building giant corporations and industry and foreign trade and eventually imperialism. And the plight of former slaves in America, the plight of freedmen or black people in the South, that falls down the list of priorities, one by one by one. While meanwhile, state by state, the Union Army is gradually removed from the South. A process that is completed with the Compromise of 1877. There was a disputed presidential election that year. It's somewhat similar to the disputed election from early on in your lifetime, or perhaps right before you were born. Bush v. Gore. The electoral returns from the state of Florida, in that case, were disputed. This is back when we had paper ballots, and there was something quirky with the paper ballots, and it was questionable as to whether they'd been properly counted. In that case, the issue comes before the Supreme Court as to would there be a recount or not, and the court says no, and George Bush wins. I mention all of that because it's somewhat similar here in that there were electoral returns from the state of Ohio in question. Ohio and Florida have then and now a lot of, well, then in the case of Ohio, a lot of electoral votes, right? These are oftentimes swing states that could swing the election one way or the other. And here, as in 2000, whoever won Ohio was going to win the election. In this case, procedurally, it lands before the House of Representatives. Procedurally, yes, yes. And there was going to be a vote in the House, and whoever won that vote would win Ohio, would win the election. And the Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, and if his name is familiar to you because you at one point had to learn the presidents, you know he's going to win. He convinced enough Southern Democrats to support him by promising them that if he won, he would remove all the remaining elements of the U.S. Army from the South. And that's what happens. Hayes gets the votes from the Southerners. Hayes becomes president. Hayes removes all the remaining elements of the Army from the South. And that's the end, more or less, of Reconstruction. That's the end of the powers of the federal government to enforce Reconstruction. It could perhaps be enforced in the courts, but guess what? It ain't gonna be. Supreme Court will, in effect, time after time after time, sanction the rise in the South of white supremacy in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. When white Democrats slowly but surely take control through violence and intimidation of each and every state government in the South, Republican Party by 1900 be more or less eliminated from the South. It becomes a one-party region. The goals of said party being very clearly stated, white supremacy. Now, they couldn't go back to black codes. Black codes were too blatant. Now that you have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, you would have to engage in some kind of, you might say, color masking. Masking your intentions just enough to pass muster before the law. Making it look just enough, sort of, kind of like this has maybe nothing to do with race, or maybe it does, but it's just enough to be constitutional. Let's take, for example, Jim Crow laws, which establish in one word what? These are much more narrowly tailored than black codes. Remember, black code says you can't vote, can't carry firearms, can't do this, that, and the other. What does Jim Crow laws establish? Segregation. Jim Crow laws establish the segregation of the black and white races in the South. Can't go to the same schools. Black people can't go to the same parks, restaurants, hotels, public transportation, like back then, streetcars, train cars, anything that we would call a public accommodation. Any public space would be segregated by law. What's the Supreme Court have to say about Jim Crow laws? I mean, it seems to me that if you're telling black people you can't go to the same public places or the same schools or the same whatever, that's a violation of the 14th Amendment, telling people they don't have the same right as other citizens. What's the Supreme Court say in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson? Separate but equal. Sure, you can have separate facilities mandated by law for the races as long as they're equal. Well, they weren't equal. They were never equal. The point of Jim Crow was white supremacy. The point of Jim Crow was to establish daily reminders of the inferiority of a race of people and a superiority of the other race. But the court rejects that and adopts the fiction of separate but equal, which will stand, legally speaking, for the next 3/4 of a century. While at the same time, the Supreme Court issues other rulings that one after another gut the meaning of the 14th Amendment. Well, it doesn't apply, broadly to the states. It doesn't apply to individual action. It says no state government can, deprive you of life, liberty, or property without due process. It says no state government can treat a group of citizens differently, but if a private individual wants to, by saying, I don't want black people in my restaurant, 14th Amendment can't do anything about that, says the Supreme Court. If you consider it a violation of black people's rights that a mob of white people surrounded them at the courthouse and murdered them with guns and a cannon, is that a violation of those black people's right to bear arms and to protect themselves and assemble legally? Nah, because that wasn't the state, that was just private individuals. So the meaning of the 14th Amendment is gutted, undermined by the actions of these new state governments and by the decisions of the Supreme Court. Then you have specifically efforts to undermine the 15th Amendment. We call the right to vote the franchise, one of the fundamental rights of citizenship in our democratic republic. So if you are enfranchised, it means you're given the right to vote. 15th Amendment, enfranchise black men. So if you are disenfranchised, that right is taken away. So how are black men in the South disenfranchised during this period without southern states going so far as they could not and just say, well, black men can't vote after all? That would be a clear violation. You got to be more clever than that. What do? What would be a way that you could prevent black men from voting without outright saying, quote, black men can't vote? Without using words like black, white, etc.
Put economic restrictions on voting?
Yeah, black people have been slaves. When they become free, there's no land redistribution. They're very poor. They're probably tenant farmers living on some white person's land. They're probably sharecroppers who barely make enough to pay their rent, right? So if you were to require a tax to go and vote, that doesn't say anything about being black, but it sure as hell would prevent most black people from voting because they don't have the money to pay a poll tax. What else? Black people also under slavery were deliberately kept from learning to read and write, right? Most of them. So most freedmen at that time were illiterate. What if you required a literacy test? What if you had to read some portion of the U.S. Constitution to be able to register to vote or to be able to vote? Again, it doesn't say anything about black or white, but it sure as hell disenfranchises black men because most of them are illiterate. Now, don't we have a thorny issue here? Because aren't there a lot of poor white people that are also poor and illiterate and can't afford a poll tax or pass a literacy test? Well, in the case of a literacy test, that's usually up to the discretion of the registrar, which is a local person. So a white man could come in and be like, I can't really read or write. Can you sign your name? X. Okay, you're literate. You're good. Black person comes in. Please read and interpret this section of the U.S. Constitution. Oh, you can't? Okay, well, you can't register to vote. Discrimination in registration. In the case of the poll tax and other restrictions, you had grandfather clauses. Say, if your grandfather was a registered voter, you don't have to meet these new requirements. What's the significance in the 1880s or 90s of somebody's grandfather or invoking somebody's grandparents? What's that got to do with anything? Well, if you're black, your grandfather was probably a slave, and therefore most definitely not a citizen and not able to vote. If you're white, there's a real good chance your grandfather was a registered voter, and therefore you don't have to worry about it. Again, a way of disenfranchising black people and not white people without using the words black, white, or otherwise. That make sense? Poll tax, literacy test, grandfather clauses, so on. Property ownership requirements could also be used. Again, with those grandfather clause type exemptions. States create classes of crimes that they call crimes of moral turpitude, which are crimes that they thought were more commonly committed by black people, that if you had committed such a crime, you could never vote again. And then again, the entire purpose of this is to disenfranchise black people. Things like these are entrenched in new state constitutions between the end of Reconstruction in 1900 and the early 1900s. And every single southern state has a new constitution by that time that has these kind of provisions in it. And then the coup de grace of all this is the retelling of Southern history. When working on my dissertation, I interviewed a civil rights lawyer who had worked in school desegregation cases and all the way up to the 2010s, but some of the original ones that had been filed in the 1960s, and he remembered that in the 1970s, in schools in Alabama and elsewhere, once they finally went beyond having, one or two black students who could petition and go and integrate or desegregate a white school, once they moved beyond that to actually integrating schools, black kids who traditionally often didn't have textbooks at all or had really old hand-me-down ones, they encountered these textbooks in history classes. And this guy remembered from, 50 years before, he could quote verbatim from this history textbook. It was used for fourth graders in Alabama. And he told me, go find this textbook, and I found it, and it was, of course, exactly as he said. And he's, again, quoting verbatim from it. This is in the 1970s, when my own brother was alive, so not that long ago. History textbook in Alabama talked about the way of life before the war. That was wonderful. It was idyllic. It was great for everybody. It asked you to imagine as a fourth grade child waking up in the big house on the plantation. And you go downstairs and Mammy, the slave mother, cooks breakfast for you. She's raised you your whole life. And this part is actually often true. But then you go out and you ride the plantation on horseback with your father, the master of the plantation. You go around to the slaves and they're all so happy. Oh, and by the way, it says they had slaves to, quote, help with the work. To help with the work. And you go around, they've got, quote, rows of bright white teeth, and they're telling Master John they got more cotton than they can pick. Times are great. Everybody's happy. It's wonderful. You go down to the slave quarters with your mother, the mistress, and she's, quote, the best friend the slaves have, and they know it. This is life before the war. And you play a game of cowboys and Indians with Jig, the slave boy, who agrees to be the Indian and to be captured. Think about the subtle implications in the mind of a fourth grader when they're imagining this old world where you would go and play with the black boy and he volunteered to be the Indian and get captured. But then, that was all destroyed by the War of Northern Aggression. For simple greed and economic reasons, there was a war that had nothing to do with slavery, they say. And regrettably, the South fought valiantly. They fought as hard as they could. They fought proudly, but it was a lost cause because they were outmanned and outgunned. North had more industry, had more people. So even though you fought hard, you were destined to lose. But what happened then? Even though some elements of that old South are gone with the wind, you could redeem some of what you lost. You could get back some of that old society, which is to say, without saying it, you could get back white supremacy. That was the one thing that you could hold on to from the old society. And that's what the process of redemption is, getting that back. The way that textbook tells it, it says Black Reconstruction was a time when government was put into the hands of inept people who didn't know what the hell they were doing, ignorant people who didn't know how to run a government, black people who couldn't even read or write, and their white enablers who lied and cheated them. They couldn't maintain law and order, says the textbook. Law and order were lost. People that couldn't protect their own families, and government was in the hands of men who were inept and incapable of running it. And this is the part that this attorney remembered and quoted to me years and years later. He says, it happened at that time that a band of white-robed figures appeared on the streets of Pulaski, Tennessee. The Ku Klux Klan did not ride often, only when they had to restore law and order. And when law and order were restored finally by the Ku Klux Klan, there was no need for the Klan, and it disappeared. This is a textbook, again, that is in use in classrooms in the United States in the 1970s, depicting the Ku Klux Klan as an honorable institution that existed only to restore, quote, law and order in the South, because government was in the hands of black people and their allies. This is what historians would call lost cause mythology. I've gone over by 2 minutes, and I do apologize. Any questions? Anything at all? Okay.